Hi guys, welcome to yet another episode of Sundays with Jessica. This episode number 70, is forever going to be special to me because I have with me today the first guest ever, Haroon Khalid. And Haroon has authored several books. The one we are going to be discussing today is Walking with Nanak. And besides that, we'll also get to know him better as a person. And let's see how it goes. So, hi, Harun. Thank you so much for doing this. How are you doing today?
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing great. I hope you're doing well as well.
Yes, I'm doing great too. So, I really, really loved your book, and there were so many moments throughout. While I was reading that I wanted to put down the book and just think about what you've written because you've expressed everything so beautifully. So, what got you into writing? Did you read a lot while growing up? And what was the inspiration behind you starting to write?
Yeah, no, I think so. My usually when you speak with writers, like they've been reading and writing since they were children. So my wife Anam Zakaria is also a writer, and she was an avid reader from a very young age. But I think my writing journey was kind of unconventional. So I got into reading much later, almost as an adult. I think I was still in university, so 21, 22, 23, around that age. That's really when I got into reading and I started reading voraciously. And I think how I see it is that once you get into reading and you get into and you read a lot, I think the writing is almost like a natural process that comes
Mhm.
from reading. And that's kind of how I got into writing. I really wanted to explore non-Muslim history and heritage of Pakistan. I was really into archaeology. I was really into travel and wanted to kind of physically see, explore these spaces and then write about them. And that's kind of how my writing journey started.
Okay. And who were the people who supported you throughout the journey? And you mentioned Iqbal Kaiser, he's played an important role throughout the book and he's accompanied you in various of your journeys. So what was your journey like, the writing of this book?
Yeah, so I mean, there's this so many people that you can't even imagine
Mm-hmm.
where you are based on the help and the support that you receive. I think for me, in terms of my immediate writing career, I feel like Iqbal Kaisar played the most pivotal role because even though I really wanted to, let's say, travel and explore and see old Hindu temples, old Sikh gurdwaras in Pakistan, I did not know where to begin because at that point nobody was publicly doing this work. I mean, now you have a lot of social media channels
Yeah.
who are writing about this history and heritage. But that's I'm talking about 2008, 9, or even slightly earlier. And it was kind of social media was still in its infancy, and there was not many kind of uh, avenues to know where all these sites and shrines are. So I
Mm-hmm.
was I was privileged then that I came across Iqbal Kaisar, and he had done a lot of that work. So it almost felt like, yeah, this is exactly what I want to do. And I kind of clung on to him, and he was very generous with his time. So then he would kind of then take me and to different sites all over Punjab. And then that kind of eventually, so I was started exploring, writing about so learning about the history and then writing about and then the context and the situation of those places in newspapers. And that's kind of how my writing started. So it began with newspapers initially, and then eventually I thought that I want to bring them together in a book form, and that's kind of how my first book came, second, and then Walking with Nanak is my third book.
Okay. So, there was a moment during your visit to Rohtas Fort. Am I pronouncing the name right?
Rohtas, yeah.
Rohtas Fort. And when you went out of it, your wife searched up the fort and it was like two tourists were beheaded there. So at any point did you feel like stopping and not wanting to explore more?
I mean, sometimes like travel can become tricky. So the story that you're talking about this fort is it's a very iconic fort on the GT road, so close on the road that connects Lahore to Peshawar and then Bengal in India. And there's this fort built by Sher Shah Suri, and it's kind of off the main road. And there's a Gurdwara associated with Guru Nanak there. So yeah, we went there, and it was like evening, and we just kind of explored the place. And then on the way back, Anam, my wife, kind of Googled a bit about the place, and it turns out that it was a bit of a scary place, because there was some violence and against tourists and all those things. But I think, yeah, I think not knowing in this this case almost kind of helped us do this visit. If
Yeah.
if we had done that research before, I don't think we would have, I guess, dared to go. And especially like during the time of the day, so we went in the evening, not realizing. But I mean, then you would have kind of chosen, let's say, a Sunday or a morning just to make sure that
Hmm.
you are safe and secure. But I guess that's part of the process, especially when you're trying to talk about things that are kind of off the main beaten path. So places that are not really visited by a lot of people. When you're trying to explore those places, I mean, you end up in places that are isolated. A lot of times there was not even a road to drive the car on. So you had those kind of fun encounters, and I think over time they become part of the story as well. So
Hmm.
I had that's how I see it. So it's not just about getting to a particular place and writing about that place, but then eventually the story also becomes is that how do you get to that place? How
Yeah.
isolated is that place from civilization and so on and so forth. So I enjoy that process now as well.
Which place out of all the shrines and gurdwaras you visited do you feel have had the most impact on you personally?
I mean, it's impossible to answer that question because there's so many. I mean, even like Nankana Sahib, for example, when I first visited, had a huge impact on me. Kartarpur Sahib, this is before it became the Kartarpur corridor.
Yeah.
That had a huge impact on me. I think also then Aminabad, where Gurdwara Rodi Sahib and all this. I mean, so literally every place I went, I think they had a very different kind of impact on me. So, for example, with Nankana Sahib, the beauty was that all those Gurdwaras were so well renovated, and it's such a big Sikh pilgrimage that happens there. So it was so I saw that place from a very different perspective. Then there were other places that were completely abandoned, or that had become Sufi shrines, or that had become schools. So just to be in that space, and then almost like be the first person to kind of go there
Yeah.
in terms of like associating it with Guru Nanak. I think that itself became a very different experience. So it really depends. I mean, so I think all of them had an impact on me, but in a very different way.
Yeah, and you know the Pancha Sahib story that you've mentioned, that even though you knew the story behind it, when you touched it, you felt most connected with him. And when I first shared the story with my family that it actually did not happen, it's not a part of the Janam Sakhis, they all dismissed it, not even considering it a possibility. So did you ever face any backlash or people saying that, oh, he does not know what he's talking about?
Yeah, a lot. I think especially with Panja Sahib, I feel like people get very sensitive about it,
Yeah.
and you can almost understand. But it's also like, I mean, I'm not the first person to say this that the rock kind of existed, came into existence after. In fact, I mean, I'm using other Sikh sources. In fact, a lot of Sikh historians have talked about this um, before me, after me as well. But I think that's kind of the beauty of religion. Like, I mean, I think especially in the modern world that we live in, we need to prove religion as a scientific reality. I feel
Mhm.
like that's kind of part of the problem. I mean, we need to really appreciate the beauty and the truth of religion. We need to think of it as art, as kind of as something which is open to different interpretations in a way. So, for example, even with the Punjab Sahib story, and I think that was kind of my attempt with that chapter as well. That whereas I'm on one hand, I'm talking about how I know that historically this Punjab is created later. So there's no Janam Sakhi. Even Janam Sakhi, which are the earliest sources on Guru Nanak's story, don't mention that. So I know that Punjab Sahib, for example, that Punjab was created later, but as a devotee or as somebody who really appreciates Guru Nanak, when I'm putting my hand there, despite knowing that this is not his hand, I'm still able to immerse myself into that story. And that's kind of where art and literature and so I feel like that's the beauty of religion that we've kind of lost in the modern world. So it's not about scientific truths. It's really about how does it make you feel and what it does for you at that moment. So I think Punjab Sahib is a story that I guess a lot of people feel sensitively about, and that's primarily because they don't engage with history.
Mhm. And this entire debate of my saint is powerful than yours, and your book actually introduced me to Nanak, Guru Nanak, the son, the wanderer, the poet. That's what you intended to do with the book, right? And but do you think that 100 years from now, a lot of years from now, people would fail to see Baba Nanak as an accumulation and as all of those things, and would further exacerbate the issue of the my saint is powerful than yours?
I think we're already there, and we've already done that. And I think that's also kind of, and I see that across religions. So it's not just Guru Nanak. You see that in all religious traditions. There's a one of the most unfair things that we do to our religious figures and spiritual figures is to kind of dehumanize them. So they become these larger than life figures who are performing miracles. I mean, if Guru Nanak spoke very vehemently against miracles, and he spoke, I mean, his poetry is full of humanizing his own experience. So that's something which is very essential to his message as well. And that was very reaffirming for me to see as well. So for me, Guru Nanak becomes more extraordinary, like any religious figure or even any historical figure becomes more extraordinary when you think of them as humans. So they had the same challenges, the same insecurities that I as a human do. And they were, and how did they address, how did they let their human experience inform what they were doing? So the spiritual journey becomes much more powerful, important for me to understand if I'm able to relate to it. Now, if they're larger than life figures to begin with, then they don't really interest me a lot as a human. So I think unfortunately, that's something we kind of have done across religions. Um, we've raised our religious figures as larger than life figure who were superhuman before even they were born. And that's kind of where we lose that human touch, which is essential for any spiritual religious kind of relation.
And you've shed some light on how by the time Gurudom has reaches the final Guru, and it has come a long way from what Guru Nanak started. And when we look at those images of the first and the last Guru, they're so contrasting. So what do you think were the major key points that led from the peaceful movement that was started by Baba Nanak to the Khalsa, establishment of Khalsa under Guru Gobind? And do you think
Yeah.
the other gurus carried the essence of the teachings of Baba Nanak?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think I've been thinking about this. I mean, even after I wrote the book. Now, of course, it's huge. I mean, if you look at the iconography of Guru Nanak versus Guru Gobind Singh is very different. One of them is a
Yeah.
warrior and the other is a spiritual figure. Now, like having said so there is a difference in how these two images are being imagined and how even the devotees see these two images. But having said that, like so my point was to contrast these two images, but the point is not to kind of show that oh look, he's somebody's wrong and somebody's right. Like that's not the point. The point is to understand how did it evolve to become what it became. So it's a very, and of course, I mean, and every movement, may that be religious, may that be political, may that be cultural, evolves and changes time as the situation around the community changes. So for example, with Sikhism, I mean the opposition that Sikhism and the Sikh gurus had with Mughal kings, for example, and the violence played a very, very important role in then kind of becoming the Sikhism as we understand today. So, for example, Guru Arjun's assassination, execution actually plays, for me, like that's probably the most pivotal point in Sikh history and Sikh Guru history after Guru Nanak and before Guru Gobind Singh, because that really shapes how Guru Har Gobind then redefines of the guru. Now, what is also really interesting to see, I mean, now we have the advantage of history and we look back and we think about, oh yeah, this is how it was supposed to evolve. But but we have to really imagine what the situation was at that point. So I mean, imagine this that the gu- you have the guru who's the head of the movement has been executed. Like it's like just imagine like how easy it would have been at that point for the movement to completely disintegrate. And I think that's really where Guru Hargobind had to really kind of use a lot of his own charm and charisma to kind of bring together a community. So even before Guru Gobind Singh, Guru Hargobind very, very important role in making sure that the Sikh movement and Guruhood kind of carries forward. And then in fact, in many ways, Guru Gobind Singh is defining himself, is looking up to Guru Hargobind and defining his Gurudom through that perspective. So Guru Har Gobind, I feel like is also very, very essential and very, very important in that context. So I think that's like, I mean, without the execution of Guru Arjun, I feel like that really changed the course. I mean, if that had not happened, perhaps the movement would have evolved in a very different way.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. And you mentioned that when you read Babur Bani, that reignited your interest in Nanak. So were you surrounded? Did you hear a lot about him while growing up? And how did you come across Babur Bani?
So not at all. And I mean, now things have changed, but growing up, Like, I mean, you know of Guru Nanak because he's such an important figure, but I don't think many Pakistani students grew up with any stories of Guru Nanak or learning about him. So for me, the learning was very like chosen. Like I decided to read books about him and to learn about him, and then through Iqbal Kaisar, I was kind of learning more about Guru Nanak, and then I think that then I became more curious and then started reading. And I think he first introduced me to Babur Bani. So I read it and kind of really was kind of blown away by how he was describing um, Babur's invasion. And I think for me, like that was also a very interesting thing to explore. Whereas with Guru Nanak, and that's before I did some research on him. But the idea was that you think of religious figures and you think of them as, I mean, especially in the modern world, like there's a tendency to think of them in a particular way. But then when I read Babur Bani, it almost felt like the messaging that he had just felt very contemporary to me. It felt almost as somebody who would have my kind of spiritual beliefs or my political beliefs. And I think that's kind of what the vision was. So I was able to see him as a human, as opposed to a larger than life figure. And I think and I think my exposure, as in my lack of exposure to Sikhism, I think also played a very important role in me taking this perspective. If I had grown up, excuse me, if I had grown up in a particular culture, I don't think I would have been perhaps able to see it from that perspective. So I think that really helped.
Iqbal Kazari mentioned him again. How did you meet him, and how has your relationship evolved over time?
So Iqbal Kaisar, I met him at a university event. So he was invited by one of my, so I was taking a course and he was invited to come and give a lecture on that course. And during the, and so it's really, I mean, now that I think of it, it's almost like spiritual how these things come together. But I was reading a book on Guru Nanak at that point and I was really curious. Like I felt like the book that I was reading, once again, it's a collection of his Janam Sakhis, a collection of his stories. And I just felt like it's not really giving me a good sense of who that human figure was that I'm trying to connect with. So I think Iqbal Kaise then came and he had done a book on Sikhism in Pakistan, and that's incredibly rare. Like people did not do that. So it was almost like, wow, like I mean, okay, so this is one man that I can actually use to kind of learn from and and I really liked his approach of actually visiting places and sites. So I think that's kind of so I met him at a university event and then I just kind of became associated with him. And I think over time, I mean now we're very close friends. I mean, he's in Pakistan, I'm in Canada, but every time I go, like I make it a point to meet him, see him. We have family ties. Like I'm friends with his son, his grandchild, and so he knows my daughter, and I'm very close. Even now we have very close friendship. So even though we don't do a lot of work together, but I feel like there's still a very strong bond and connection.
So was this the first, this book was the first work that you did in collaboration with him, or has
So
he
no,
helped
no.
you?
So I think Iqbal Kaisar has been pivotal in fact all my writing. So even though I mean, so initially I was writing newspapers and articles on different temples, shrines, practices, and almost 80-90% of them were helped. Like I was going to those places through Iqbal Kaisar. So with every tour, every travel, he was taking me there. I think what is different about this book is that perhaps for the first time and our relationship also as a part of storytelling. Whereas before that, the focus was more about shrines and practices and the site. I think for this book, then I really wanted to kind of use our relationship also as a way to tell a story. Really way also as a way to explore the relationship between Guru Nanak and Bhai Mardana. So there was a bit of a storytelling technique that I was following. But even in my next book, Imagine Lahore, Iqbal Kaisar is very pivotal. My book on Waris Shah. I mean, in any writing that I've done, I think it's been very very pivotal. His contribution.
Yeah, and this is your third book, right?
Yes.
Walking with Nana. So could you expand a little bit more on the previous two books that you've written?
Yeah. So my first book is called A White Trail, which is essentially a travel log around religious minorities in Pakistan. So what I did was I went to a lot of religious festivals. So around Pakistan, so Hindu festivals, Sikh festivals, Christian, Baha'i, Parsi, so I went to those festivals and I kind of wrote a travel log about what does it mean to practice Holi in Punjab in Pakistan, where there's a very small Hindu minority. Um, And then what does it mean to what does Christmas look like in Lahore? So it's kind of that's kind of the first book, and it is based on a lot of interviews that I did with people, and then really talking about what does it mean to be a religious minority in Pakistan. Like that book is really about that, but using festivals as an entry point into that story. The second book is called In Search of Shiva, and it's about these Sufi shrines in Pakistan that kind of challenge our conception of what we think Islam is. So these are shrines of sacred dogs, sacred cows, phallic offerings, and so on and so forth. Now that's these are practices that you don't usually think about when you think of Islam. And my idea and my whole argument in that book is lines actually are a beautiful depiction of how different religions interacted in South Asia. Before we kind of started thinking them as separate and fighting with each other, they kind of borrowed and shared from each other. And that's kind of what the second book is about, that how does Islam interact with Hinduism and other religions in Pakistan or in India and South Asia? And how do those practices manifest themselves through different shrines and traditions? Walking with Nanak is my third book. And after that, I have a book on Lahore, which is the city that I'm from. So it's a travel log around Lahore as well. But once again, using travel as an entry point to talk about the history of the city. And so and my latest book is From Varis to Heer, which is a book on Heer Ranjha and Varis Shah. It's a historical fiction on Varis Shah. Like what was his time like, and what inspired him to write Heer Ranjha? What was happening politically, socially, culturally that he was responding to? So it's a historical character of Varis Shah. And then the other half of the book is a rewriting of Heer Ranjha as Varis Shah is writing, and just looking at how these two worlds of Heer Ranjha and Varis Shah are interacting with each other.
And you've mentioned in your book that in Pakistan, instead of teaching about the local heroes like Waris Shah, they rather focus on foreign inspiration like Shakespeare and the Punjabi thing that you mentioned that it was looked down upon. But do you think that your writing would have any impact on it? And
Yeah, no, I think I will not give myself so much credit and power. I think things that happen at the top with the state, like I mean, the outreach of that is just so much more than what, let's say, my book can do or my writing
yeah,
can be done. Like even if, let's say, Walking like, is the bestseller, like it will sell what 1,000, like 20 to 30,000, or at the most, like say 100,000 copies. And if a book sells 100,000 copies, like it's really an amazing book. But whereas we're talking about a population which is 230 million people,
yeah.
school-going kids. I don't know how ever many school-going kids are. Like we're talking about millions and millions of people. So it's a very different scale. Um, yeah, so I think, I mean, I'm not sure if my goal is to change the education system. Like philosophically, yes, that's the idea. But in some ways, I would say the writing is a response to the education system, and hoping that at some level, students who are coming and reading, I guess a lot of that propaganda are then kind of engaging with these kind of writings as well, and kind of using that to challenge some of the things that they have learned and interacted with.
But comparing to the situation now to when you were growing up, things have certainly changed, right? And how was it when you were growing up?
I mean, things have changed in a way, but also in some ways they become more hardlined in some ways. So. Um, I mean, yes. So, for example, there's more. I mean, you have social media, you have more interaction with Sikh history, Hindu history, you have interaction between kids from India, Pakistan, especially on social media, and so on and so forth. But what has also happened is, especially as antagonism between the two countries has arisen in the past few years. So, I mean, that was not the case when I was growing up. So now, I mean, we've had war in the
Yeah.
past, I guess, couple of months, a couple of years, and so I feel like the space for hatred has kind of increased. And that hatred almost then translates into, in India, it will translate into an anti-Muslim hatred. In Pakistan, it will translate into an anti-Hindu, anti-Sikh hatred. And so in some ways, you can almost make an argument that the situation has become even more hardlined than it was. Uh, yeah, but I mean, even though there's more avenues to learn, I'm not sure if that's necessarily what is happening. So I mean, I was growing up in Pakistan, which was Ziaul Haq's Pakistan, so it's very different. Like Islamization was at its peak. Um, at that point, I mean, even though then you had Musharraf era, which was very different in terms of modern liberal politics, and even today, like the state is not as hardline as it was when I was growing up, but I mean, things change depending on the situation, and particularly like how antagonist India-Pakistan relationships have been in the past few years. I don't think things have improved necessarily.
Yeah. And aside from the book, you also run, I was reading that you also run a non-profit organization, Kissa, right?
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that? How did it came into being?
Yeah, so KISSA is an organization that my wife and I run in Canada, and the idea is to essentially tell immigrant stories in their own words. So we use, I mean, both of us have relied a lot on oral histories and talking to people and kind of capturing their stories. So now we're kind of using that in a Canadian context, so talking to immigrants, recording their oral histories, and telling those stories through different mediums. So this could be writing, this could be exhibitions, this could be festivals. That's primarily the idea behind it.
Oh, okay. And besides from all of this, what do you like to do when you're free?
I mean, I like to play music. So I play a
Okay.
few instruments. So, I mean, when I get some time, that's the idea. I'll play some drums, guitar.
And you're currently working on reimagining Lahore, right?
No, no, that was an old book. I mean, currently I'm focusing more on kissa and that kind of storytelling. So I'm exploring more documentary kind of storytelling. Like I plan to write a book soon, but I have not able to get to it. But right now the focus is a lot more on kissa and documentary and those kind of storytelling.
Okay. And that was it from my end. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I was really delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. No, it's a pleasure.